Hitman 2-3, this is Hitman 2. What's the status? Over. 2-3, stand by. Goliath, this is 2 Bravo. Request permission to engage enemy paratroopers and attempt to snatch a grid Papa uniform 259er, 119er. Break.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. This is Ben Powers coming at you from the Commander's Voice. My guest today is Mr. Peter Hart. He's a former oral historian at the Imperial War Museum in England. He's retired now, but he held that post for 39 years. He's a respected World War I scholar, an expert in oral history, and he's also doing work on the Second World War. He's got some regimental histories coming out. Hopefully we can get to discussing that today. Pete, welcome to the show.
Oh, it's great. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this, Ben.
So, as I kind of laid out before we started recording, I'm a huge fan. So this is a real treat for me. Just showing everybody here. If you only read one book on the First World War, this Combat History on the Great War by Peter Hart, I highly recommend it. But what I'd like to start with, Pete, is just talking about oral history in general. A lot of folks, I think, when they think about historians, they picture guys in libraries going through old books or letters or piecing things together. But oral history is such a rich, vibrant component because you're hearing it from folks who are there who may only have a worm's eye view, but they actually experienced it. So if you could share a little bit with the audience about what oral history is and how a good oral historian goes about their craft, I think that'd be a really exciting place to start.
I will. The first thing, I like to start almost on the attack, because you hear a lot of people criticize oral history for various things. And I just want to take that on head on by looking at other sources. And you see people in their libraries. If you read a regimental history or a war diary, what you're getting, and you were in the army, you know that what you're getting is what the adjutant or the colonel wants you to get. That's what it is. It's always the unit on the right that retreats and you conform. It's not you, it's them. And so I just make the point that official records aren't always right. People say, yes, but what about letters? Letters, who are you writing to, Ben? If you're writing to your dad or your brother or your uncle, you might say what's happening. You might not as well. If you're writing to your mum, you're going to say, hello, mum. How's it going? I hope this finds you. I'm in the pink. And we've got examples of 2 letters written on the same day. You see what I mean? And one to the mother saying, everything's fine. The other guy, oh God, it's murder here. And he gets killed next day. And he's told his mum he's out of the line. So yes, letters can't always be trusted. Diaries, people say, well, diaries. Well, and this is no disrespect to teenage girl or boys, but these are young people and you're at the center of your universe with a diary. You see what I mean? Everything is through your eye. Now, I understand that's about oral history as well. What I mean is with a diary, people work things through. And often,
yes,
the colonel's I swear occasionally, you'll just have to put up with it. The colonel's a complete bastard. And then 2 days later, the colonel commends them for a bit of work. Good colonel, thank you. Oh, what a great boy he is. I really like the colonel. And so, and you get that in letters as well. Which one's what he really thinks? So there are problems. Photographs are a laugh. And the colorization program that people are falling into makes it even worse because it's removing the evidence even further. So what I want to say, if you're writing to your girlfriend, do you put, dear darling Ethel, shat myself 4 times yesterday, sick as a dog, I've got dysentery, my head's hurting, I've got nothing to wipe my backside with. Do you? Or do you write something? You don't.
Everything's great.
Everything's great. And, I bayoneted 3 Huns yesterday. In went the bayonet and all the suppressed psychosexual stuff. He hasn't. He probably works for the Army Service Corps back in the depot. But the point is that there's problems with lots of media. Now, I'll come on to the problems with oral history. But oral history gives you a chance almost to get the zeitgeist. Now, I talk too much, so you're just going to have to keep a controller on me here. Let's talk about what it's good for. Well, it's good for the mundane detail that makes up life. So all of us have a life that's made up of small things. And somehow oral history gets to grips with it. So, and somehow, let me just show you with an example. If you take food rations.
Certainly.
Now, one informant, one interviewer, will tell you. I'm talking about First World War veterans here mainly at the moment. They'll tell you they're all dead now as well. So they did tell you. What did I have to? Well, I had bully beef and biscuits, and to give you a list. Is that useful to you? You can actually read in a document what they got.
Certainly.
It's not. Then you'll get someone else who says, "Oh, I had bully beef. It was in the tin. It was in the tin, like those corned beef tin. It had a little key on the side, and you used to turn it off, turn it to get it off. And where pork and beans, it wasn't pork. Pork my ass. It was a lump of pork fat in baked beans." And they'll go through, and they will give you a surrounding detail that you won't find in a list of what they've got. Then there comes what I call the story. And my favorite one was the self-same baked bean tin, bully beef tin. And I'm not a soldier. You were, I'm not. I'm a civilian. I was a horrible student and I was a punk rocker. That's my background. It's not military at all. The only thing I have in common is when you're hungry and you've got a bully beef tin, the key always, you lose it and you're drunk and you try and open it with a knife. What happens? You cut yourself.
You're gonna cut yourself.
And the number of old boys who are sat in front of me said, "Oh yeah, I had a bit," and I caught the key fell off. Go find it in the mud. So I got me bayonet, 18 inches of cold steel. I cut me out. Look at it. You can still see it now. 4 years in the trenches. The only time I was wounded was by a bully beef can, and me bayonet. and you start to realise that's giving you a real insight into life. That's not going to be in a letter. No one's going to write that in a letter.
Exactly.
And that gives you, that's what oral history is all about. But then there's another layer of detail. For instance, what do you do with the tin cans? Now, in a bad unit, they'll throw them into no man's land. Now, you're an ex-soldier. You know what I'm going to say. You don't do that if you're in a good unit because you have to patrol. What happens in no man's land if you kick a bully beef can and it hits against a stone?
You're going to draw
You're
fire.
dead. Yeah. And so suddenly you realize, hang on a minute. One unit buries it, another unit throws it behind, and another unit throw it in front. That unit that throws it in front isn't that good. Now, you don't, it's only an indicator. It doesn't mean, but do you see where oral history can be really quite eye-opening about things? The same thing is people don't believe it, but whale oil, rubbing whale oil on your feet to prevent trench foot was a real indicator of whether a unit was good or not. Because a good unit would do it. A bad unit, and they could never quite get round to doing it. You see what I mean?
Yes, sir.
So that's one side. So now what else? Well, I think one of my favorite oral history gives you, you've got a point to get across. And you've always got this. And I find sometimes one of the best ways of doing it is through a sort of a humorous story. And one of my favorites was an old bloke, Rymer Jones. Whenever I do an impersonation, when I do the Goon Show, Blood Knock, now that would be foreign to any American, but it's sort of, hey, it sounds like this. And he was telling me about this old, we had an old major, and he was an artillery man, and he said, you don't want to bother with all that nonsense you've learnt at Woolwich. That's all rubbish. If it's cold, cock her up a bit. Now, you and I laugh. It is a reasonably amusing story. What happened on the first day of the Somme and the days before the Somme with the bombardment? It wasn't accurate enough. One of the reasons it wasn't accurate enough was people didn't take meteorological corrections properly. Now, you look far too intelligent to have been in anything other than the artillery. So, what
it was actually in signals.
Well, you see what I'm saying?
Yes,
engineers, signallers, and artillery, and these days the service corps. But anyway, the point is that is a really interesting story. That old officer, he's telling a story. Everyone's meant to laugh and go, "Oh, look at the old boy. He's got, what is the point of all those stupid mathematical corrections?" I'll tell you what it is. It makes a difference to a shell flying through the air. If the air is cold and just cocking her up a bit, you're only trying to hit a couple of trenches. They're only a few yards wide. See what I mean?
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Now, I want to talk about something else, which is action stories. Now, here I've got two parts to go. And again, you've been in, all right, let's talk about the police. if there's a fight in a downtown, where'd you from in America? Illinois. You look like Illinois. Downtown Illinois bar, and there's this huge scrap, and the police go into the bar. They can't find out what happened, can they?
Nope.
There's two reasons. One, nobody really knows. Who hit who first? What was the cause of the fight? What was the cause of the fight? How come he's lying on the floor with a knife in his back? I don't know. It wasn't me. See what I mean? Now, that's 5 minutes after. Now add 70 years.
Yes, sir.
And I am dubious in the extreme about people who want to make too much of a fuss with oral history about an actual bayoneting incident or an attack or something, because it's not how the human mind works. They're under great stress. They're stressed. What you get from oral history is, I call it I've got to look, the commonality of the experience. And I'm not going to go academic on you, because I'm not. What I mean is, when they go over the top, it breaks down into certain things that everybody goes through. Now, I don't know whether you've ever had such an instance, and some soldiers do and some soldiers don't. But there's the briefing, there's the building tension, there's the fiddling with your ammunition pouches, there's just waiting for the time to go, there's a last handshake with your mate, there's trying to avoid your face showing any fear, there's trembling hands, and then the countdown starts, and the countdown, 5 minutes to go, men, 4 minutes to go, men, and then the actual countdown, and then they go over the top. And do you know what happens then? We don't know.
Exactly.
Because nearly all the informants that I've interviewed will tell you, there's a couple of exceptions, a chap called Joe Murray, who's in the Royal Naval Division at Gallipoli. He could tell you what happened. He could tell you what he had in his pockets in 1915. I couldn't tell you what I had in my pockets now. But what it does is they go over the top, and what they all well, I seem to be on my own. They're not on their own. It's just that they're in a state of shock. And so oral history, use it for what it's good at, which is describing how things work, what it's like to be in a trench before you go to top. Don't ask it what it's like to get to a German trench, because you're going to get nonsense.
Do you think that idea of commonality, though, because what you've described and what I'm thinking about, I got a couple thoughts. I'm thinking that anytime anyone's under duress, you get that sense of tunnel vision. So you've got these fellows who can remember everything that happened before the whistle went off, but once they get off the parapet and moving forward, they get that tunnel vision as well. And that creates that sensation of being all alone. So there's the commonality of so many people report that, you can kind of start getting multiple data points. So, okay, this is a human phenomenon. It's not particular to Pete Hart or Ben Powers. This is a common phenomenon of any infantryman.
Absolutely. And that's what I'm you said it better than I did. But that's it. And then often they'll come to and say, well, sometimes they'll just say, I don't want to talk about what happened. There's reasons for that. One way to end any First World War interview was to say, did you ever bayonet anyone? There's two reasons for that. One, most people don't. 99.9% of people don't bayonet anybody unless they're wounded.
Yes, sir.
And the other is, if they did, they certainly won't want to talk about it, because it probably haunts their nightmares to that day.
Yes, sir. I have a friend who made that exact point, not about bayoneting, but about time in GWAT. And truth in lending, I'm a GWAT veteran, but I don't consider myself a combat veteran. Like I said, I was in signals. So, but you ask that question to somebody, and they're either going to feel like they were less a soldier because the answer is no, or you're going to make them relive their worst day because the answer is yes. So it's just a crap question no matter what.
That's it. That's exactly. Well, oral history have to be sensitive. One of the things I try and do is sometimes a soldier can lead themselves into trouble. They start commenting on something and they make themselves look very bad. And it's my job as the interviewer to say, do you really mean that? You know, and help them back onto what the more straight and narrow, what they really think is. Because people say the wrong thing all the time. The other thing you've got to watch is not leading. If you say to a First World War veteran who's trying to please you, and remember they're trying to please you, you're in their house. If you say to them, was it cold? They'll say, yes, it was cold. Then they'll say, but I was never cold. And what they mean is, no, it wasn't, not for them. And that's they'll say, people repeat back to you what you say. This is the thing with oral history. You've got to be careful with it. When we do oral, I'll talk a bit about how we did it. When we do it, we go to their house, shake hands. You have a cup of tea or coffee. I never drank tea or coffee before I was an oral historian. I asked my an older interviewer, I said, what do you do? Because I knew he didn't drink tea or coffee. Weird bunch, oral historians. And he said, and I said, I say no. And they say, do you want a whiskey? 10 o'clock in the morning. No, I do not want a whiskey. Yeah, beer. And Conrad explained they're just making you welcome. So there's this whole socialization bit. And you say, oh, I like your garden. You know, how long have you lived here? Blah, blah. Then you get on to the interview. We always started with, can you tell me when and where you were born? Which was my own personal joke, because you're not supposed to ask people 2 questions because they never answer both of them. And I always started every interview, just perversely, because I like a laugh. Could you tell me when and where you were born? And people say, Burnley. Or they say, 3rd of June, 1892. And where were you born? Burnley. And that's just fun. And but then you take them through their childhood, and in a way it's unimportant in one sense, although it's social background, it's very important. But you take them through their childhood, their education. If they went to a posh school, you talk about fagging, if you know what fagging is, and you talk about public school ethos and all the rest. If they went to a normal school, you talk about that. You talk about boys' brigade. You talk about life. You talk about their first jobs. You ask them what a day was like at their first job. You're getting them used to the idea that they're going to have to explain. If they say, oh, I didn't like the foreman, I'm going to say, why not? I just didn't like him. Why didn't you like him? Because there's no point. There's no point in saying, oh, I don't like something, if you don't say why. And I mean, why not? And then you get them used to this, and then you edge into why they signed up, why they, the joining up process, all the rest of it, and then training. And then when you get to and all the time you keep them, and you do it in 2-hour sessions. That's the longest you can really do with someone over 80. And yes, some people do more, but I'll tell you, 2 hours is pretty well spot on. And you keep going back. My interviews, some of the long ones were, First World War, the longest was about 20 hours.
Oh, wow.
22 hours. So that's 10 visits. That was Joe Murray. Other people, when I did Second World War veterans, we got up to 35 and 40 hours.
Amazing. So when you're asking... I'm sorry, so 2-hour increments track and so. So when you're asking those questions, I understand you're getting them used to your pattern of questions. You're getting used to why they've got to go deeper. Does it also help kind of get them to go back 70 years? Because they're talking about their childhood and like all their brains in 1914 again now after a few questions.
That's exactly the idea. You make it a sort of process. It's like you ask it. That's a ludicrous thing to say. I've never asked a psychologist or a psychoanalyst, but I imagine, having watched various behavioural detective things on your American as well, you ask people about their childhood and get them, throw their minds back, and then take them through from there. The funny thing is when the war finishes, you've got them back in civilian life. You've counted the legs and arms. If there's one missing, then you're going to carry on till the present day to see how they coped. But if they go back into civilian life, you get them back into that, and then that's it. You leave them in 1922 or 1924, unless they do something in the Second World War. And that's a bit weird sometimes. I sometimes carried on if they were interesting people, because for me, shh, don't tell the War Museum.
So did you ever have the opportunity to interview more than one person at a time who might have been in the same unit or the same action?
Yes, but we'll come on to this with the Second World War. I started interviewing. I got my job in 1981. I started interviewing about 1982, and I noticed there hadn't hardly any First World War interviews. And that's my thing. I'm interested in the Second World War. I'm interested in the Zulu War. I'm interested in lots of things, Napoleonics, but First World War is my thing. And we didn't have enough interviews. So I started a project on the Gallipoli Campaign because we had about 3 interviews. We did a project about 60 to 100 interviews. Joe Murray was one of them, but loads of other great interviews. And that's where I wrote my first book. which the War Museum at the time were pleased about. Later on, they got less and less pleased with staff members writing books. It's this fake academic institution idea that they own our minds. I write them in my own time, but anyway, they were good to me, and I have no criticism of them at all. But that's how we started. And then for 10, 15 years, we were doing the First World War. And I tried to get into the Northumberland Fusiliers, but they had about 30 or 40 battalions that really fought. But I could only get one or two, and a lot. You see, First World War informants, you'd get, say, 5 of them. One would be good, one of them be medium, another one would be okay, and 2 would be next to useless. Still respected,
certainly,
still recorded, still preserved, but for a historian, there's too many mistakes. One told me, Ypres was just outside, it was on the Somme. He just got confused. And when you correct them, they don't like it, because that's not your job. Your job is not to tell them what happened. You have to watch it, because by the end, I know probably more about the soldier's daily life than half the people I interview. But I'm not a soldier, so it's all secondhand knowledge from me.
Yes, sir. Understood. And the reason I was asking about multiple folks being interviewed, I'm really interested in, although a lot of folks will say this guy's not a historian, he was a newspaperman, but you look at the work that SLA Marshall did in the Second World War with after-action reviews right after an engagement, in order to be able to, you said everybody's got their worm's eye view, everybody had tunnel vision, but if I have a chance to talk to 5 or 6 folks who are in the same engagement and ask each one a question, and it was 10 o'clock, and then Joe's like, no, it was definitely 10:30 because my watch stopped, I remembered, and maybe you get a more accurate representation in that kind of interview. Is that a safe assumption to make?
That is the exact, well, I did, my first attempt ended up being Gallipoli, because I couldn't get the single unit, so it ended up being a single campaign. It was a small place, they're all within a mile of each other, but no, that's the very point. Now, I'm not familiar with Marshall's work, because I'm not an academic historian and I haven't studied it. I'm aware of it vaguely, but not enough to comment safely. We found that giving people time for their memories to settle down is not a bad idea, by the way. But I'm not sure about that either. I think it's probably as long as a piece of string.
I understand what you're saying, sir.
It's difficult to decide. What I do know is he's right, fundamentally. And in the Second World War, I started again, and I deliberately interviewed 50 to 100 people from an artillery regiment, the South Notts Hussars, 107 Regiment, South Notts Hussars, our territorial gunners. I interviewed 50 to 100, 50-ish people from the 2nd Fife and 4. I call them the 54 Fars, 5 and 4 Far Yeomanry. They're tanks. They were in Shermans like your boys were. And what a story that is. That's the book I've just finished and is going off to proofreaders. And then I did a series, because the infantry are more important, and I don't think anybody would argue with that.
And they're the first guys to tell you that too, sir.
No, that is the problem. Well, I'm an artillery fan personally, and you don't win any wars without artillery, but you don't win them without infantry. They've got to occupy the ground.
Yes,
and
sir.
Also, it's an awful job, and there's more of them. And because of that, we did the 16th Battalion Durham Light Infantry. I'm from Durham. That's just pure bias. We did this 2nd Royal Norfolk Regiment, because they were wiped out at a place called La Paradis in a murder. 100 of them were executed by a Nazi. And then they fought in Kohima in the Burma campaign. And then we did the 2nd, 5th Sherwood Foresters. We deliberately picked non-fashionable regiments. The Norfolks are a bit fashionable, but we picked ordinary, and we got so much help from the boys. And one of the things that I'm finding slightly sad now is that when I started interviewing those chaps, it was in the mid-80s, and they were about my age now.
Yes, sir.
And I was 35 to 40, I expect. I don't know. I'm not good at maths. What's sad is they're all dead. I'm the sort of person that says they're all dead. I don't know whether they're all dead or not. but if there's one or two left from each regiment, I'd be surprised. The South Notts Hussars, who were the oldest, they were signed up in 39. I know of no, I did 50, and I don't know any of them are alive. And that is quite sad. It's also quite interesting because I interviewed them 20 years ago, and now they're all dead. What does that mean? Well, it comes to us all, doesn't it?
It sure does, sir.
Actually, another 20 years, I wouldn't object to it, 66.
That wouldn't be so bad at all.
Yeah.
So you bring up a really interesting point about the fashionable regiments and how there's kind of people get excited about the parachute regiment. People get excited about the SAS. They get excited about the more exotic type stuff. Do you find that even when you give people from the regular regiments, the county regiments, an opportunity to speak, is there interest in what they have to say among a general public, whether it's a reading public or whether it's at a museum, or do people still just gravitate to the more exotic type stuff?
Great question. I'm afraid ex-punk, I don't give a damn about the general public. As a historian, I know what's important. And these ordinary units are the bedrock of the army. And you know that from your own army. It's the unsung units that have to do most of the work.
Yes, sir.
There aren't that many special service people. We found it difficult to interview people like the Parachute Regiment because what makes them effective, I'm being kind to them here, I hope. I don't want to offend them because I really don't want to offend them. They're violent. But some of these elite units believe their own mythology.
I get you. Before you go too much further, so I just want to let you know I am a former paratrooper, and most of my audience are paratroopers. So just to let you know where we're going.
Well, but also you'll know what I mean in that case. And we found that they don't want to be interviewed in the way that we do the long sessions, the rest of it. Royal Marines were fine. I think our parachuters may be different from yours as well. I'm not so sure about it.
Yours definitely have, to take nothing away from my brothers and sisters, your parachute regiment reminds me, from what I know about them, more about our Ranger Regiment, like a special operations light infantry capability. Just that much more lethal, just that much more aggressive. Again, to take nothing away from my unit, the 82nd, but that's what I see.
And let me just be clear. I'm a grotty, spotty-nosed civilian. These people have been trained by their country to perform a role. It's not important about oral history. What's important is that they do their role. Some idiot 20 years later, like me, coming along, who finds them a bit difficult, that's my problem. Do you see what I mean? I'm trying to square the circle out. I'm not going back on what I said. They're difficult to interview. And I've had more trouble with parachutists, the British ones, than with anybody else. By trouble, I just mean not too satisfactory interviews. I've also had some crackers, though. Royal Marines have been great, by the way.
Interesting. That is very interesting. I just wonder if it goes to a certain personality type.
I'm not sure. I might have just been lucky in the people I got. That's the other thing you've got to remember. I mean, I haven't done many parachutists. Because the other interviewer at the War Museum did most of the, so like the landings in Normandy, the parachute landing in Normandy, the artillery place, I've forgotten the name of it. It's just gone out of my head.
The Melville Battery?
Yeah, that's good.
Or the Merville Battery?
He'd done Merville, yeah, he'd done all that. He'd interviewed all of them. So I did one of them, and he was a bit nuts. I liked him. But no, I wanted to do the ordinary soldiers. Because I felt that they'd respond better, they'd have more patience, they hadn't been interviewed to death, and some units they've been crawled over by people interviewing them time and time again, and we call it interview fatigue. Once or twice is probably all right, but more than that, and they're just telling the story. They're not actually reacting to the interviewer; they're just telling the story, and the story gets exaggerated if you repeat it because you just remember it as a story. You don't remember it happening. Whereas we like people to remember it happening, and you want to see their eyes glaze over.
That makes a lot of sense.
They're often in a bloody, they're almost in a bloody, I've seen people, it's got dark and they haven't noticed.
Oh, wow.
And I haven't told them because that was a First World War veteran. You look him up, Joseph Pickard, Joe Pickard, and he did 4 hours at the age of 92.
Oh,
He'd
wow.
lost his nose in the war, and he was telling the story, and we got to the place where he was losing his nose and the rest of it. Was I going to stop the interview because I couldn't see what I was writing? No, I was not. We just carried on. And
Understood.
I have the heart. I want to say something else about oral history people say, oh, he just believes everything old men tell him. Au contraire. That's very posh French. Now I know you're a parachutist. I'll have to patronize you, be rude. I cannot resist making jokes. That's my problem. But what it is I always like to think of them as little old man, bit past his sell-by, which by the way I am now, as I've said, who will waffle on, and in it there's stuff of great importance and thing, but not all of it's true. And there's reasons why is it not true sometimes. Mistakes, dates, places go all over the place. You know that.
Yes, sir.
You try and remember your last active service thing. First one, yes, you might remember the times and everything, but later on, say your 4th active service deployment. I know you're in the Signals, but you're still active service. Do you see what I mean? Your 4th deployment, it's all the same. So,
yes, sir. Things do run together.
So we try and this is the beauty, and this is what you said about Marshall. If you have South Hussars, let's talk about them. I've got a book out at close range. I told you I'd plug it mercilessly. Now that's got 50, and they were good. The average length of interview was 8 to 10 hours.
Oh, wow.
And now I always use the same example. I don't know whether you're filming or not, but or it's just sound. I don't mind. But if you just put your hand up in front of you, that's one interview. You can see through the fingers. You put 2 hands up. I can't see much of you now, mate. Sadly, this demonstration always falls down now. If you have 50 hands, then you can't see through that. You've got a complete picture in front of you.
Yes, sir.
And I understand the left field. There's always one bloke. We talk about Stuka raids, and people say, oh, God, the noise. I was terrified. Felt like the wheels were going to run up your back. The noise. It was terrifying. They always have somebody say, no, I wasn't bothered. You could tell where they were going. I wasn't bothered at all. Now, does that mean one's right and the other's wrong? No, it just means there's different personality types, and different people react to different things. Also, perhaps that Stuka wasn't coming for him.
That's a really good point. Yes, sir. You could have been a different part of the field.
So you look at different, and you join all the stories together. And people say, oh, yeah, we've got this dirty, great big book. Do you stand by it all? I stand by the book. Do I stand by an individual story about specific in it? I've tried my best. They've tried their best. I've checked it with the histories. That's as close as you can get. And I always say to you, did I go for a walk today? I'm telling you I did. Did I?
I can't verify it. I have to trust that you did.
Yeah. And in 50 years' time, if you asked me, do you see what I mean?
I sure do.
It's this idea of a literal truth, this proof, we can't even determine what happened today if you haven't got all the evidence. And what is the evidence? Muddy shoes? I don't know what the evidence is.
Yeah, I got you. Exactly. It's
going
to vary by case.
You see, this is the thing about oral history. But I did try and start this by pointing out the problems with letters, official documents, photographs. There's lots of problems with establishing the truth of things. What we call it the balance of probability. We call it the all arms. I'm a First World War historian. You know what I'm going to say, the all arms battle. So you don't just use oral history. What you do is you have oral history as a vital part. That will give you the ground eye view. It's rubbish, for instance, about commanders, because they're impacted on by 40 years of idiots who believe in butchers and bunglers and the rest of it. So they will parrot that back at you. But they're good at what it was like in a trench, what they had to eat, things like that. They're not so good at other things. So you've got them, then you've got the official documents. I'll probably tell you what time the attack started or was meant to start. Then you've got officers, some reports written at the time. Well, They might lie, they might not. If you've got an officer saying the report, and then the same officer says, "Oh yeah, I wrote it up, but Jesus wept, did I stretch the truth?" Yeah. Look, I'll give you one example. Any book you pick up, and I'm just reading books now. I'm doing a book on military humour. You pick up this. This is a history of the 16th Highland Light Infantry. The lads were dying to get into action. Were they?
A few of them probably were not.
A few of them probably were. A few of them were not. If they'd just been in action 3 times the previous month, do you think they were dying to get into action?
No,
and
sir.
Then you're getting down to just the people who are special. Because there will be some, but there are people without seeming fear. There are people, but a lot of those people without fear have nervous breakdowns after the war. Usually,
certainly.
I'm thinking of Blair Main.
Yes, sir.
Really heroic British special operative of SAS, essentially. And he was unbelievably brave, drank too much, ended up nervous break, sort of fell apart after the war, would drink. And these things, there are some people, I'm just looking at, we interviewed a bloke called Tom Adlam, who got the VC, and we didn't do many VCs. It just didn't seem to be scared of anything. I interviewed one
For my audience, sir, I know where you're going with the VC, the Victoria Cross. Could you explain how important that medal is to my audience, since we're mostly American?
Yeah, the Victoria Cross is like, is your Congressional Medal of Honor. It's
yes,
the
sir,
absolute top award for bravery. Normally you have to be dead to get it. It's normally 1 in 10 chance of surviving to get it. I interviewed one. He was stone deaf when I interviewed. I'm not going to remember his name. He's Durham Light Infantry officer. His name began with A as well. The Second World War. He got one of the first VCs in the Second World War for throwing bombs at Germans. They were shooting all around him. Anyway, after the interview, I got into a car with him, and we came to a crossing between a dual carriageway. I didn't see a gap in the first side between the cars. I certainly didn't see a gap in the other stream of traffic. He went straight between it. We must have missed cars by half an inch. And I thought, I'll never get into a car with a VC again.
That certainly explains how he's wired, though, that's for sure.
Well, the year before, his wife of 50 years, and I want to emphasize it for humorous terms, his wife of 50 years got a bit tipsy or whatever and fell off a boat on the River Tyne, which is a big river. If you think it's a big river, it's 80, 100, 200 yards across. It's deep. This was when he was about 90. And his wife fell in, and instead of doing what you or I would do, just go, oh dear, still she's had a good life. He dived in and rescued her. I mean, that's different. That's not just different from me, a civilian, or possibly you as a serving signaller in the parachutes. You passed your wings or whatever it is.
Yes, sir.
Which in our lot is terrible to pass that. This is someone who stands out in any company as being fearless.
Certainly.
So in that case, if he's not fearless, if he's fearless, why do we give him credit for being not scared?
No, and that's a great point. If you're fearless, are you brave?
It's not what I would make to him. But
or is being brave overcoming your fear? Was it special if it's a lack of fear? I get what you're saying.
Can I talk about Edward Manick? Edward Manick, the VC, British fighter pilot, shot down about 60 planes. He was bumped up because they didn't like the Canadian Bishop, so they just bumped it up so it's more. And but he was scared from the start. He nearly got sent home for being a coward, and he conquered his fear. And for me, I admire the chap who fears no fear. But I really, really admire someone who conquers his fear and to win a Victoria Cross. That's not conquers his fear to take his place in the line. This is conquers his fear and becomes a Victoria Cross, a supremely gallant officer.
No, that is truly amazing. Now, I've got 2 follow-on questions that kind of just come out of this discussion. The book that you were quoting from about the lads who are eager to get into action or dying to get into action. Do you notice when you're corroborating, like you get your oral histories and then you're going through different books, that given a certain time period, like 100 years ago, you're going to get a lot more of that, are we downhearted? No kind of stuff. And everyone's a gallant fellow. And as things become more recent, you might get a more unvarnished look at, not everybody was dying to get into action. Do you think part of that kind of verbiage was a sign of the times?
I haven't done as much work on it, but certainly in the Second World War books of the South Lot Hussars and the Fife and Forfar Yeomanry, it's still there. It's still it's not as overt and as silly as in the First World War, but it's still there. And I haven't done any post Second World War work, and my work on the First World War is limited. This is one of about 300 or 400 books I'm going to have to go through in the next, just looking for amusing quotes. The books on military humour, including of the First World War, including humour that isn't funny, black humour in the sense of soldiers' humour. So he wouldn't want to get his hands shot off, etc.
I get what you're saying, sir.
And yeah, so, but I haven't got that big experience of the Second World War. But the ones I have looked at have the same, slightly backed down a bit, but the same. It's basically the colonels and the colonel's man, often the adjutant or the intelligence officer, and they are still putting this viewpoint forward that, for instance, the Fife Forfars, as I much to their annoyance call them, thank goodness they're all dead. The Fife Forfars, they were in England from 1939 to 1944. And they kept being moved around, and they were going to be sent to North Africa. And every time the book says, the lads were terribly disappointed. Well, in the interviews, they say, well, and this is the soldier. We didn't know. I was quite happy in Huddersfield. How can you be, not Huddersfield, Harrogate or somewhere. And how you can be happy there is beyond my, it's in Yorkshire. I was quite happy. But if they'd sent me, I'd have been happy to go. And that is, you'll recognize that's a soldier.
Yes,
do they want to put their head where a big German might shoot them, or stay at home? Well, I'd probably stay at home. But if everybody else is going and it's my duty to go, of course I'll go.
Certainly.
And that for me is the underlying essence of the soldier, and why I take so much against people like someone called Joanne Burke, who say that all soldiers are underneath it psychopaths who want to bayonet people, and it's all a sexual, psychological thing. That is nonsense from what I've interviewed. I don't find that at all. I found one person I was scared of out of thousands, and I was scared of him because I thought he was nuts. I mean, seriously nuts. And he kept telling me stories about bayoneting people and setting fire to some prisoners in the cellar, and I didn't like it.
I understood. And that's completely, I can see how that would be very off-putting.
That's one. Well, he shot people, prisoners coming in. He just shot them. He's rough. It happens to any army. It's not just something that happened to your army in Vietnam or in Iraq, or our army in Iraq, or our army in Afghanistan, or our army in the Zulu War, or our army in the First World War. All armies are going to have trouble with certain individuals.
No, very true. Very true.
Who lose control of what's happening in circumstances which civilians don't really understand as well.
And I imagine if you interview enough people, you're going to run across somebody like that at some point. And
well, that was the only one. I'm not going to tell you his name. Only one. I interviewed a Pole, who'd escaped from Poland, who killed some people in a manner that was a bit abrupt, if you see what I mean, and probably not entirely necessary, but it was a part of a story which was entirely, it was that or die.
Certainly. And the circumstances surrounding something.
I had no problem with that. But this other chap just seemed to go the extra mile to kill people.
I get what you're saying. So one other question that I had for you, and we had talked about this in pre-recording, it seems as though the Great War is like a seminal event in the history of England. You lost so many people. It was such a long event. And more than World War II, that seems to have affected the national psyche. And you don't see that among Americans. I think my personal view being because we entered the war very late and suffered relatively few casualties as a comparison. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that as somebody who is an acknowledged scholar of the Great War.
Ooh.
That sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? Okay, an old punk rocker who's read some books. How about
that? It's crashed a bit.
Oh.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me, sir?
No, it went funny for a bit. You'll have to edit that out, or you'll just have to look at me looking gormless for it. Anyway, I'll come back to your question. I want to start with the British. It's the British that are weird. We have built an obsession. By the way, you know how I may have annoyed every parachutist in America? Oh, sorry, chums. I didn't mean to. I'm telling you now, you've just annoyed all the Welsh, Scots, and Irish.
And I solemnly apologize.
Well,
and to any Commonwealth nations as well.
The thing is, it's us that because it's our first. You remember your first girlfriend. You remember your first real war. We don't have continental wars in this country. We tended before that to pay, or we had a professional army who went and fought it. And the casualties, whilst painful, were usually painful for the other side, or for the mercenaries we'd hired. I mean, countries like Prussia were hired in Napoleonic things, basically hired to fight for us. And yes, we fought at the end, but if you look at the Battle of Waterloo, the Prussians did half the work, and then about a third to a half of our army, the British army, was also German. So we're not used to mass casualties. Whereas the French and the Russians, the Prussians, they've been slaughtering each other for hundreds of years. The Napoleonic Wars for France involved well, they caused it, but never mind. That huge amount of pain and suffering. Germany was fought over time and time again. The Russians smashed to bits. The casualties were appalling. Then there's the Franco-Prussian War. Terrible casualties for the French. And so the First World War, the other countries have a more mature attitude. But in our country, there's become a cult of sort of, it's like, if you put anything on the First World War, people will put RIP. They won't think, they just do it automatically. It's not real. Or we will remember them, to which I always want to put in a week's time, who was Ted James? And when they say, I don't know, he said, well, you said we will remember him 2 days ago. And it's a form of words. And they're not interested in the history. They're just interested in being sad. It's so sad. Of course, it's bloody sad. We had nearly 1 million dead. But the French had a lot more dead, 1.5 million. God knows how many the Germans had dead, 3 million probably. The Russians, I don't think you need more than the number of fingers on my hands to count. And I think that, so it's the British that are just a little bit over the top about the First World War. And it's all been bound up with poetry and things like that, and not enough history. It is an enormously painful and terrible war. And that's why we should study it, not just go, oh, it's so sad. We should actually look at it and see what's happening and try and understand it. Why was Haig, in my view, a really good commander-in-chief? Why? I mean, half your listeners are going, he's an idiot. But you've read my book, you know why I think that. He's an organizer. He's not really a general. He's a commander-in-chief. He's like the boss of Walmart or some huge American corporation. He's sort of controlling everything. Why aren't the Americans that bothered about it? I think there's a lot of reasons that I think might be, but I'm not American. And I think it's partly because it is a shorter war, but your casualties pro rata are worse. You really get the clatter in the last 3 months of the war. The Battle of Meuse-Argonne is bigger than anything I can imagine. I know it's technically your third biggest war, but I think the Meuse-Argonne's your biggest offensive, and I think it's your biggest battle. It's huge. It's 2 million. And the British historians look at it and they go, we don't like Pershing. Tend not to like Pershing. Sorry, if you're American, you really shouldn't like him. He's everything that people say Haig is. Not too much of a thinking general, but over promoted. He was a brigadier in 3 years before, and now he's a full general. But let's not talk about him so much as the tactics are a bit crude at the start. But you know the thing about the Americans, they learn. So do other countries, but the Americans do learn in the Great War, but it's not very. the way they learn is just by flinging things at it, gradually learning the importance of logistics. Logistics at the start are poor, and they just throw men at it and sort it out and get good at it. And by the end of the war, they're an effective force. But I believe that on the last day of the war, you'll have to check this statistic for me, and I'm not a statistical type of historian. I believe more Americans died on the last day of the war than died on D-Day. You can check that out.
I will definitely run that one down.
And if it's wrong, you can say Pete was wrong. I won't mind at all.
Check the comments later, folks.
Yeah, no, because that's what we've been told, is that you had more dead there than you had on D-Day. And that's the last day of the war. That was Pershing's fault. You should have done what we did and stood off. Well,
statistically, that kind of makes sense with the number of the people that were in Musargon compared to the number of people who hit the beaches at Utah and Omaha. Yeah, mathematically, there's some sense there.
Yeah, and you did attack. The Americans attacked full on. And I in my first book on 1918, which was called 1918, A Very British Victory. That was in itself a joke with my American friends, and I do have American friends, believe it or not. And it was a joke. I'm terrible, I know. But even while I was writing that book, I backed off the idea of the Americans, which is Johnny-come-latelys. And what I noticed was that it took the British from August 1914 to the 1st of July 1916 to properly mobilize, right?
Yes, sir.
That's the first time in real action. All the other battles are nothing compared to what the French and the Germans are up to. So that's what? You're good at maths, I'm not. Let's call it 2 years, okay? You lot declare war in April 1917, and you're fully in the war, in my view, on the 12th of August with the Battle of Saint-Mihiel. And I don't count, I know you think that marine thing in some wood is a big thing. But again, to the French and the Germans, it's not. It is to you because it's emotive, it's important to you, and that's fine. But in a scale
you just broke my best friend's heart, by the way, who's a Marine aviator. But
it is interesting about it. If I could remember the name of the wood, it would help a lot. It begins with B, and the Americans are always saying,
Bella Wood, right?
Yeah, and of course it's important to you, but it's not important to the Americans and the British or the French or the British, French or Germans, because it's quite a small wood.
Very much so. And it was only a couple regiments. It was one brigade of one division. So, and that's the point, not to take words out of your mouth or put them in there. That's when we're crossing from history to mythology a little bit.
Yeah.
To take nothing away from the guys who fought there, but that has become like not just military history, but that's mythologized by our Marine Corps.
And everyone obsesses about them saying, retreat, we only just got here, all the other things that they're all meant to have said. And they're great characters and the rest of it. Then there's the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, which is a practice, but it is a proper battle. But the Germans are retreating anyway, but it's still a proper battle. But Meuse are gone. That is your Verdun and Somme, but you're not interested. And I see the books coming out, and the historians, the American historians that I've seen, seem to be either very good or populist, and we don't count populist historians. We don't think anything of them. Because they're earning a living, and good luck to them. But they don't interfere with what other things. But you have some excellent historians, and I just can't remember their names. People do comment on my inability to remember things.
No worries.
Except history.
So I'm coming up on my end of the time here, but what I would really like, if you don't mind, and we are recording video, this is going to be on my YouTube channel. If you could hold up your book, I'd love to plug that a little bit, and you could tell us a little bit more about it.
Well, this is it. It's at close range, and it's by me. And it was my first Second World War mass interviewing project. And the guys in it have become almost friends. And if you look at you've probably got enough listening to your podcast, but I've got podcasts too. Pete and Gary's Military History. It's just changed its name. And we've done about 10 on this regiment where we do their voices. And but to me, it's just all quotes. And people say, it's had some good reviews. And I always say, yeah, those guys were great. And the book is about them guys. And I'm an oral historian. I've got my role in it. And I pick and tell the story but they're the guys who did it, and they're the guys that I respect, and they're the guys that when I look at that book, I remember Ray Ellis, I remember Harold Harper, I remember John Walker, I remember being in their living rooms, and I remember talking to them. They're all dead. I remember the things that happened to them. I remember the ones who were badly wounded, and I've forgotten his name just at the moment, but there you go, that's me. And that, for me, that book means a lot to me. I don't know whether it's going to be a success or not. I doubt it. As you are aware, most military history books are not successes. But we keep on, because in the end, it's always been my hobby as well as my work.
Yes,
and now that I'm retired, I find myself working much longer days. And I used to tell my boss, a chap called Bryn Hammond, used to say, I can never find where you are, Pete. Somewhere, Gov. And well, he's one of my best mates as well. So I mean, the War Museum were very good to me, and those people that I'm just so proud that you can listen to those interviews on the Imperial War Museum website. You don't have to pay; you just listen to them, and the interviews are fantastic. And you can hear my horrible high-pitched voice going, and then what happened? We always used to joke at oral history. There were two main questions, and this is a tip for you. The two main questions are, then what happened? Followed by, why did you do that?
Well, there you have it, folks. We have boiled down the art of oral history into two main questions. So, Pete, I'm right up against time now. Thank you so much for coming out. Everybody, once again, this has been Pete Hart, former oral historian at the Imperial War Museum, World War I historian, published author. He's got a new book. Is that book's out now, right? Folks can get on Amazon.
Yeah, you can get it on Amazon, yeah.
Okay, so At Close Range, it's an oral history of a World War II British Artillery Regiment. So, Pete, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much. I've loved it. Cheers, mate.
Cheers.